Good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Recovery Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN AM for Friday, July 16th, 2021. And our top story today, when two is a lonely number. We'll take a look at spousal caregiving. Well, joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, Laurel Whitman is the president-elect of WellSpouse Association. Laurel, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us in the program this morning.
Great. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, this is such an important topic, caregiving, spousal caregiving, and I want to get into the details. But let's start out. Let's talk about the impact of the pandemic. A lot of isolation. We quarantined. What was the impact to caregivers and maybe folks on the mature end of the spectrum?
Sure. So, yeah, the pandemic for some people actually didn't create a lot of change, right? So a lot of our members have actually been isolated in a lot of ways because of the nature of their partner's disease or illness or disability. It can be a really isolating and a lonely experience. And so a lot of people actually found it didn't make a lot of change. But for many people, it did, of course. There are certain benefits. Maybe being able to work from home is a benefit for a lot of families. Suddenly they weren't rushing off to work and wondering what was happening back at home. So that could be helpful. But a lot of families, for instance, like my family, couldn't bring in aides anymore. So they immediately went from having help around the house with their partner to not having people there to give them that support that they've become accustomed to.
Yeah, and let's talk a little about just caregiving in general. I mean, it's something that I think a lot of people, especially younger people, maybe don't see until you kind of get to a little bit more advanced age. But this is something that is really needed. It can either be delivered by a family or family member, or there are also external resources. But this is really something that I think can drain time, resources, and in a positive way. But I think people really underestimate that.
That's right. Yeah, caregiving. So for our members, many of them are doing all of the care themselves. That's very common with spousal caregiving, and it differentiates it from other kinds of caregiving. Our members and families in our situation tend to put in more hours per week on average than other types of caregivers, something on order of 36 on average. For some families like mine, the needs are much higher. My husband needs 24-hour care. He cannot be left alone, and somebody has to provide that. I'm very fortunate that in my situation, I'm able to bring in outside care again, at least prior to the pandemic, and now as the world is starting to open up a little bit again. But for many families, that's not the case. They're doing this kind of care themselves. Maybe they're getting some assistance from family members, children, parents, friends, but it's not a given that those relationships allow for that kind of care. And a lot of this care is very personal, right? We're talking about things like changing diapers and specialized medical care. It's not something that everyone can get comfortable with, either as from the caregiving side or from the patient side.
Yeah, and you talk about some really important points. Before we kind of carry on with caregiving, let's talk about WellSpouse Association, what the mission is, not for profit.
Sure.
What are you trying to achieve through WellSpouse with your membership?
Yeah, great questions. And thank you for asking them. We are working on awareness. We want to be the place that people go when they find themselves in a situation where they are caring for a partner, whatever that degree is. In talking about the language a little bit that we use. So obviously the name of our organization is the WellSpouse Association. We use WellSpouse as kind of shorthand for, to distinguish us from the partner that has the illness or the disability. But it doesn't mean that we ourselves are completely healthy either. We also use the term spousal caregivers. I'll use that interchangeably. And that can be a little bit of a tricky term, right, when we talk about caregiving, because a lot of people don't self-identify as caregivers. They may feel, they're going to 2 or 3 doctor's appointments a year with their spouse. And that absolutely qualifies them for some degree of caregiving. And they may not realize the strain that's starting to come with that, some of that work until much later in the course of caregiving. So we use that term interchangeably, but we think it's important that people start to identify in those roles. So WellSpouse is reaching out to all of those kind of people, right? And we also use the word spouse interchangeably. It's partners. We have a number of LGBTQ members as well. So we are very inclusive, whatever this relationship looks like to you and whatever you call it, we'd like to provide services. At the heart of it, we're about providing support for people in these roles to make their lives a little easier.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great mission. And again, I think people really underestimate, especially if you're a younger person, you think you're invincible, unless you see it firsthand. And there are some people, I'm not saying, I can't paint with a broad brush here, but this is something that we all will experience at some part of our life if we have parents that are still alive, or an uncle, an aunt, a partner, as you say, that we're going to be caregiving. Last question for this segment. Let's talk about the mental health element to this, because a lot of talk these days about mental health. There's the impact of the quarantine on an isolation and what that means in terms of mental health. But as a caregiver, I know one of the things that you all do is you have this community where people can come and share their stories. That's kind of cathartic, and I think probably very helpful from a mental health perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, depression and anxiety are very common among people in our situation. That's not limited to the spousal caregiving, but I think it tends to be heightened by the nature of this role. We've talked in recent years, and I think this has gotten accelerated by the pandemic, about things like ambiguous loss, which is the idea that we are facing a lot of losses on this caregiving journey that may not rise to the level of, call it, external recognition. The loss of a spouse is very clear, but the moment your spouse has to give up walking and start using a wheelchair or a walker for their own safety, that's one of those losses that we don't have a good way of marking. And it's one that's borne really by the caregiver by themselves. We talk more about complicated grief. How do you grieve a situation when you're in the midst of it, right? When this goes on for years and years, as is the case for many of our members and many caregivers more generally, how do you deal with those losses when you're still on the train? And we're starting to recognize too that there is a PTSD element to a lot of this kind of care. PTSD is not just limited to the trauma of somebody coming back from war, which I think is how we all traditionally think about it. I have trouble now when I go into an ER with my husband and I hear the beeping from the alarms. It takes me right back to an ICU stay he had that was, particularly difficult for both of us. And it makes it hard for me to give care in that moment and to be fully present like I want to be. So the impacts can be very complicated, and, depression and anxiety are super common, but we see a lot of these other kinds of needs to process from our members. And so you're right, the peer support we think is really important with WellSpouse. We have a network of support group meetings, 20 of them that meet each month right now. That number in list is increasing, and they spread out across the country. We think that peer support is really important because people who understand what you're going through are probably best positioned to help you and to be a resource and to reduce some of that isolation you're feeling. There are a lot of great resources out there, therapy, social work, clergy members, et cetera. But it's just not the same as coming from somebody who's been in your shoes. And then you get a lot of very practical advice, from people who have done this. It's not a replacement for the medical care your spouse may need, but we've all had the experience of being in a doctor's office for 10 minutes and then you're kind of shuffled out and they go on to the next person. And that's just not enough time for people who have complex medical situations or even straightforward ones that you're dealing with for the first time to really get what you need from those appointments. And our peer support network and resources can help kind of fill in some of those gaps.
Yeah. Well, Laurel, I need to take a very quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about caregiving, the sense of loss, and what maybe some steps that you can take to improve your caregiving situation. You're going to want to stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
Are you stuck with a low credit score, a credit report and score that's causing you to be denied credit or pay higher interest rates than others for the same things? Then do what Terrence did and call Credit Repaired for your free credit evaluation to help restore your credit.
I started thinking about buying a new house, and my score wasn't where I needed it to be. I called and spoke with one of the representatives, and we just had a good conversation, and I liked what he was saying.
Just one call for his free credit evaluation was all it took to start back on the track to repairing his credit.
I'm seeing the deletions and I'm getting the report, so I know something's being done. It does make a difference to me.
All it takes is one call to get started.
Credit Repair has given me a second chance to have a better credit score.
Don't let a low credit score hold you back another day. Do what Terrence did and make the call for your free credit evaluation.
Call 800-819-4152. That's 800-819-4152. Again, 800-819-4152.
Welcome back. We're talking to Laurel Whitman. She's president-elect of the WellSpouse Association. Laurel, thanks so much for staying with us this morning.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you. Great topic. And I really like kind of shining a light on something that I think is something we're going to have to deal with at some stage of our lives. Let's talk a little bit more about the sense of loss. There's obviously the potential financial loss of dedicating time, taking a step out of work. But as a caregiver, there's loss of companionship, loss of friendship. A lot of times your spouse, your partner is your friend, your best friend, and you lose some of that. Can you talk a little bit more about that sense of loss, that feeling, and how maybe you can overcome that or try to overcome that?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, it's, there's a number of losses. I think about them in several ways, right? That there are the losses from the disease itself that your partner, my personal experience is that my partner has a progressive disease that has both physical, cognitive, as well as emotional components. He has what is now considered advanced multiple sclerosis. And so the losses we have seen have been the physical ones over the years that, he went from walking and working and, just like me and you, I presume, for years to this rapid decline where he ended up, needing 24-hour care. He doesn't leave the bed except for medical appointments. And really that means hospital stays at this point. So those losses go right alongside, the loss of relationships and the changes of relationships. As I mentioned earlier, family and friends often don't know how to reach out. They're afraid to reach out. What we often see among our members is that people will back away, and that includes both the person who has the disease or disability, as well as the person caring for them. Perhaps a caregiver has kind of been on the schedule for family weddings and, graduation parties and events, and a couple of times they weren't able to go. And so, you stop getting those invitations, and that's a very isolating experience. But the one that really, separates this experience from others is that loss of companionship. For most people, their marriage or their partnership is the singular relationship on which all of their other relationships are based. And all of their decisions are based, where you live, where you work, whether you have children, how you raise your children, how you retire. All of those things really flow from that partnership that you have. And when that partnership changes, and it can be in small ways that aren't necessarily obvious, or it can be in very large ways, like my husband's illness, it's a series of losses all along the way. And, we talk about how often it is that you'll get your feet underneath you as a caregiver, right? And then another wave will come, and it might be a small wave, or it might be a big wave, and it kind of knocks you off your feet again, and you start that process over. So it's a feeling of it can be a feeling of being very unmoored too, and disorienting, in the sense of, all of these losses happening all at once, and the things that you come to depend on don't make sense anymore. Again, as a personal experience, for me, there were a lot of milestones I looked at, out ahead of me in my life. And this happened from a young age, right? So things like go to college, get a job, get married, get a better job, have children. Those things all started to change as my husband's disability progressed. So it can be very isolating. It can be hard to talk about. And that's why we find this kind of peer support, where you can go into a room and not have to explain these losses to people, is really validating.
Yeah, and you can people can share their own experience, and I think you probably feel, Laurel, like you're around people who know you, and they can offer advice, and they're in a position where they've been through the same thing or something similar. They can offer advice, and I have to think that this is really uplifting, and like so many support groups out there, whether it's for divorce or other things that happen in our lives, because we don't get out of this life unscathed.
Right.
Having people share their experience is probably really beneficial to the community.
Yeah, absolutely. There is one thing, I like to talk about when we have an opportunity to speak in front of this kind of audience, that's both probably caregivers as well as non-caregivers, and that's this idea of self-care. We talk a lot about self-care. Other people tell us a lot about how we need to do self-care. And I think to a lot of caregivers, that actually comes across a little hollow. I've joked from time to time, mostly with caregivers, that, people telling me to take care of myself can often feel kind of like a checklist item for them, that they've checked that box, they've told me to do what I need to do, and they've done some of their job, right? And there's something about hearing about self-care from other people who are in the situation and know that it's difficult to get away from your partner. It's difficult to get away from your house. It's difficult to go away for a night or two. We all know these are good things that we ought to be doing, and I do them. But there's something about hearing it from people who are going through it that makes it a little less hollow.
Yeah.
So that's something I like to share, to be a little careful with some of that language if you're outside of this community. Mm-hmm. Because it's very difficult for us to do it. It becomes one more task or one more burden, that we feel, that it's hard for us to stay on top of.
Yeah. And do you think some of that feeling, you were talking about maybe leaving people out of invitations to weddings or family events, do you think some of that is just out of your own, not your own, but people's inner fear? It's really, when you think about, we're the Broadcast Retirement Network, and so we deal with all these issues. When you think about retirement, you're thinking about, as a 22-year-old, you're thinking about, hey, that's 40 years away. But there's a fear that, hey, this could be you, or I don't want to get saddled, or it's going to derail me. And then you tend to put your hands up in the air and say, or bury your head in the sand like an ostrich. Does that drive some of that behavior you're describing from people external?
I think it does. Yeah. And I do try and be sensitive, and I try and be sensitive about it, because you're right. I think a lot of it does come from people's own fear. We're very tuned in nowadays to saying the right thing in the right way to the right person at the right time, right? And there's just no way that being on the outside, kind of speaking to people inside the situation, that it's not going to be emotionally charged at some level, right? And so I think there is a lot of that fear that if I don't know that I'm saying the right thing at that right moment, then I just won't say anything at all. I won't make that invitation. I don't want to put myself in that situation. I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to hurt the other person. So I do try and be forgiving, in my own life. And that's one of the things, I counsel when I'm in a support group and I hear someone talking about some of this is, to be a little forgiving. It's very, it's one more burden that falls on the caregiver to kind of watch out for other people's emotions in that situation. But we don't want those relationships to go away. And so that it is something that I think we put a little time and effort into, and it can smooth some of that over.
Yeah. Well, Laurel, really great to talk to you. We did not do this topic justice at all, but people can certainly go check out the website, which we've been displaying at the bottom here. And look, we look forward to having you back on the program again very soon. We can continue the conversation. So enjoy the rest of your week. We'll talk to you again very soon.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel. Great to see you. Thanks for sharing your perspective. That wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Have a topic of interest, someone you think we should talk to, drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, check out today's edition of our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse. We're back again tomorrow, this time for BRN Weekly. We'll have a very special guest, and we'll take a look at some of our best segments for the week. Until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Waiting here for you to take and drink of. But if you're tired of the same old stuff.
Are you being audited and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.